Hey everyone, today I'm going to show you how to set up dynamic material blending in Blender 2.9. This should work in version 2.80 and above. You could maybe use it in previous versions of Blender, but you won't have access to Eevee. The great thing about this is that it works in both Cycles and Eevee, and it's dynamic. This is something that we have not been able to do before, so let me just turn on our helpers there. And you can see I've got this cabinet model that was downloaded from 3D Model Haven, I believe it's called. It's under the CC0 license, so I will include a file for this effect in the description. You can download it from Gumroad for free if you so choose. And then for those of you who want to donate a little bit of money for the file, again, it's optional if you want to do that. You would have my gratitude, and then of course that would enable me to create additional tutorials like this in the future. But again, all the files will be completely free if you'd like to download them. I will include a beginning state so that you can follow along with this tutorial, and then an ending state, which if you want to just pick up from where the tutorial left off, you're more than welcome to do that as well. But essentially, this is, of course, dynamic material blending. So you can see I can move the model here, and it will blend according to its proximity to the ground. Again, I have a Suzanne head here. It does the same thing, and it blends pretty well. And so what we're going to be doing is we're going to be doing a little bit of setup. It should only take maybe about 5 to 7 minutes for those of you who know what you're doing. Obviously, it's going to take a little bit longer for me because I'm going to explain every part of what I'm doing. And then I'm also going to give you kind of a demonstration of the add-on for this. There is an add-on that someone created called Blendit, and it's basically a quote unquote one-click solution, although the method that they use is slightly different than the method I'm going to show you here, and there are some trade-offs for that. So I will show you that at the end of the video if you're curious. And that add-on only costs about at the lowest point, I think it's like €6. And then if you want to support them in their development, then there's some additional tiers that you could pay for the add-on in order to get support and help them fund any future development for that. So I'll include a link in description for this project file. I won't include any part where I demo the add-on in the beginning file because it's their add-on. I don't want to include any of their setup for that. If you want to buy the add-on, follow the link in the description and feel free to, do what you think is necessary. But so this was going to be the end result that we're going for, and let's go and start up with the beginning file. So I'm going to pop up here, go to begin, and hit our begin demo. So here we go. I've got the setup here for what we're going to start with. I do have a monkey hidden in the background, and I'll show you how quick and easy it is to transfer this effect from one model to another with just a little bit of simple setup. But without any further ado, let's get started. So on our cabinet, if I go into my shading tab here, I have just one simple group node that's set to the surface of the material output there. And it's a pretty simple shader setup. This is actually how the shader comes from 3D Model Haven setup. If you download the Blender file itself, it's all CC0, like I mentioned before. So just keep that in mind. You can use it if you want. It's just three image maps that are being put into a principled BSDF and then into the material output. And then for the ground, it's very similar, same deal. This ground plane is just a plane that's been subdivided and kind of sculpted a little bit, displaced a little bit. And then I have four image maps that are being tied together with a group node. And the reason I do this whole group node thing is it's not 100% necessary. It's just easier for organization. It's easier to look at. And you kind of could tell what's going on. So we're going to primarily be dealing with the cabinet here. And just before we get started with everything, I do have to make a warning that this effect is geometry based. So if this ground plane was just a plane with 4 points, 4 vertices creating the face, this is not going to work. So we need to have enough geometry in order for the vertices to detect their proximity to other vertices between the two models. Now, this is similar to the way that game engines do vertex painting or vertex proximity. The other way that you could potentially do this is by using a image map, but the problem with image maps is they tend not to be dynamic. So you'd have to find a way to make that dynamic. Now, what we're going to end up doing is there's a mild workaround, and it's a little unusual. I don't completely understand the way that it works under the hood, but I will explain what I do understand about it and how it makes sense to me. And it gives us a little more control. There are actually going to be 3 ways that we can control this, and we can control the blending amount on a per object basis as well as globally. So that's the nice thing about this. So just to show you what the geometry looks like, if I go into edit mode, You can see that here it's a lot more dense than it needs to be for this piece of geometry, but again, that's for the effect. So this is not really something that I would expect anyone to want to use in like a game engine, obviously. A lot of game engines have their own solution for this, like Unreal Engine, for example. I think it's a pixel depth offset or something like that, or pixel height offset. They have different ways that you can kind of do blending similar to this. And it's kind of this method that we're doing in Blender is inspired by that process, but it is a slightly different setup. So just keep in mind that you're going to want to do this for stuff that you're doing in Blender. You're not going to want to move this to a game engine. And then the geometry for the ground plane is actually pretty dense. So for those of you on lower end machines, just keep that in mind. I could probably get away with unsubdividing this once. So if I wanted to, get rid of that extra level of subdivision, I could do that. But for the purposes of demonstration, this will give us enough of an overlap between the vertices that it will produce the effect that we want. And then the last thing I want to mention before we get started is actually this pie menu. A lot of people ask me, how do I get this pie menu with the save and all that? This is actually an add-on called Machin3tools. It's a free add-on, although if you buy it on, I believe, Blender Market, I think it's like $1 or something like that. It's free. If you want it, or if you want to support the development of Blender, then buy it on Blender Market for $1. It's absolutely phenomenal. I can't live without it personally. It's definitely a must-have for me. I highly recommend it. So I'll put a link to that in the description down below as well if you want to get it for yourself. But it's again called Machin3tools, made by the wonderful, amazing Machine, who also makes Decal Machine and Mesh Machine, which are two add-ons that are absolutely brilliant and wonderful and huge in the community. I can't recommend them enough. So feel free to download those if you want them. And then of course, Machin3tools. Anyways, without further ado, let's talk about the setup here. So there's a little bit that we have to do in terms of the object data properties of this mesh. So I'm going to go into vertex mode. I'm going to make sure everything's selected, and I'm going to go into my object data properties panel over here. And what I'm going to do first is I'm going to create a vertex group, and I'm going to call this blend. And I'm just going to hit assign. And that's going to assign all the vertices on the model into this vertex group, which is going to be used in the modifiers that we set up in a moment. And then the other thing we need to do is we need to create a second UV map. So we're going to create a second one of these. I'm going to rename this warp with a capital W. And before we can start to do our stuff in the modifier tab, I need to make sure that our UVs are set up properly. So the way that I understand that this works is I need to, again, making sure I'm on warp and not UV map here. We want to be editing the warp map. If I change the UV map, our textures from before are not going to appear properly on the model. So this is a model that is actually already UV laid out. You'll want that in order to achieve this effect. Otherwise, you may have some problems with your model. And what I'm going to do in my warp map here is I'm going to select all of my UVs by hitting A. I'm going to hit SX and type in 0, and that's going to scale everything to the 0 coordinate, or it's going to crush everything in the X direction. And then I'm going to hit SY0, and that's going to crush everything in the Y direction. And then all of my vertices are now on a single point. And then inside this image tab here in the end menu, I'm going to, with all of those still selected, type in 0 here. I might have to do it a couple times because Blender and its decimals are really weird. And now you can see that all of those vertices that I have in my UV map on this warp map anyways are put at the 0, 0 location in the 0 to 1 UV space. And that's going to allow us to do a funky workaround later with a UV warp modifier, and I'll explain that when we get there. So let's go back to our layout tab. And now that we've done all the object data setup, and again, once you know this and you've done this a few times, it becomes second nature. It's really easy. This is basically all the setup you need to do, and then all the modifiers and shaders we can just copy over between objects. So I'll show you that with the monkey in a bit. So now I'm going to go over to the modifier tab. I'm going to add a vertex weight proximity modifier, and I'm going to select our blend vertex group, and the target object is going to be the ground plane. And so you can pick that from here. I just like to use the picker on the side. Now the proximity mode we're going to use is going to be geometry, and you can leave it on vertex, edge, or face. I find that vertex gives me the best results. And then our lowest and highest values here are going to be 0.5 and 0.05. Now you can modify these if you want later on. They basically change the amount of blending that we're going to get out of the two models. And the way to visualize what's actually happening here is if I go over here and hit the weight paint mode, you can see here that the proximity of the two meshes is actually creating this modifier is actually creating this proximity weight map. And that's what we're going to use to control the amount of blending between the two materials later. So you can see here that all the vertices that are close to the actual vertices of the ground plane are getting the most effect, and then it kind of has a fall off. The last thing I like to do, which is just a personal preference, is change my fall off type from linear to sharp, and that just gives us a little bit of a tighter fall off. Linear actually doesn't look that bad, so I'll leave it like that for now, but you can put it on sharp if you want to have it a little bit tighter in, a little more controlled, so that way you're not getting too much blending. But you can always play with that after the fact. All right, so that's our vertex weight proximity modifier. And then now we need to set up two more modifiers here. So the next one we're going to do is a data transfer. And as the name implies, we're going to transfer data from one mesh to another. So our source mesh here is going to be the ground plane, and our vertex group is going to be the blend group. And then we're going to use face corner data, and we're going to say custom normals, and we're going to change this to nearest corner and best matching face normal. And essentially what this is doing is it's transferring normal data from the ground plane. It might be a little bit easier to see here. So if I toggle this on and off, you can see that the normals on the cabinet are kind of adopting the normals from the ground, and that changes the shading. And basically what that is going to do is it's going to make it a little bit easier for us to see the material as it blends later on. And that's really all we need to do with this data transfer. So again, we set up the source and the vertex group, and then change this to custom normal with nearest corner angle. You can change this option if you find that there's something else you like better, like projected face interpolated. It's going to do some different stuff, and it gives you some different results that might not be what you want. Personally, I like nearest corner and best matching face normal because it's much more gradual. All right, and then the last thing we need to do is we need to set up a UV warp. And so here we need a UV layer, and that's going to be our warp layer. And then we need to create two objects in order to control this effect. And this is where this kind of funky workaround comes in. So I'm going to go back to my material preview. I'm going to hit Control C to reset my 3D cursor in case it got moved. And I'm going to create a empty. And it can be any empty, it doesn't really matter. And I'm going to call this one 0, and I'm going to hit Shift D, create another one, right click to reset it to the 0, point, and name this one 1. And then in the transform panel in my end menu, I'm just going to select X and Y and type 1. And you can see now that we've got two empties at 0, and 1. And that's kind of, so the way that this works, as far as I understand it, I know I've been kind of rambling up to this point, but the way that this works is that it takes the data from 0 to 1 between these two um, empties that we've created, and it kind of tells Blender that we're going to be blending for the UV map between the 0 to 1 space. It'll actually become a lot easier to see when I set up the materials in a moment, but let's finish up our actual modifier here. So we have from object, we want 1, and then to object 0. So it's considering everything in between that space, and that's how it's going to kind of tell it to blend. And this is going to be our global control. I'll show you what that means. And then of course, a vertex group blend. So now you're looking at it and you're like, well, it's still not blending. Why is it not blending? And that's because we haven't set up our shader yet. So clicking on the ground plane, I'm just going to grab the ground material group and hit Control C. And then I'm going to hop back over to my cabinet, and I'm going to paste that in and move it down. And there we go. We've got those two nodes in there. Now I need to create a mix shader. So I'm going to plop that down, connect this up. And you can see that it's giving us a 50% blend, which is not what we want. So now we need to add in a UV map node. And I'm just going to snap that to the grid and connect this here, and then choose my UV warp. And you can see now it is actually blending with proximity, but we want additional control over it. So we're going to get a color ramp, and we're going to put that in there. And that is not that complicated of a shader setup, in all honesty. And now if I move this white down here, you can see I get a lot more blending out of here, a lot more control for the blending on this cabinet. So there we go. We basically have finished setting up our dynamic material blend. And this is different than the ambient occlusion blend method, because of course anything that gives itself ambient occlusion, and it's also screen space based. So that might not be the best solution for us. I will turn on ambient occlusion just to get some self shadowing in here. It looks a little bit better in my opinion. But now if I move this up and down, you can see that based on its proximity to the ground plane, it's getting that blending. And then with the empties that we created here, if I move these, so it doesn't matter if you move them in the Z, it doesn't actually do anything. But if I move them in the X and Y, you can see I can get more blending the more I move it out, up to a certain point, of course. It kind of breaks if you go too far out. But if I snap it over here, you can see I get more blending. And then with the other one, it's a similar effect. I can kind of move it and it gives me more blending or less blending depending on where it is in 3D space. So this will affect everything globally because all of our modifiers that we are going to transfer over to any other model that we want to do this with is going to depend on the placement of these two here. And then if I move them together, it doesn't really matter because they're relative. So let's show you how quick and easy it is to transfer this whole setup over to the monkey. So in the shading group, we have a principled BSDF. I'm just going to move this out here to the left. I'm going to grab my cabinet. I'm going to select this whole thing, except for the material output. I'm going to deselect that, and the cabinet, I'm going to deselect that. Hit Control C, go over to the monkey, paste it, and then move this over here like this, and just snap it to the grid. And then here I'm going to change my surface to shader, and then for the BSD, you can see, there we go. So now I have everything set up the way I needed to. I can collapse this down if I so need. So there we go. Simple and easy setup for that. And then of course I'm going to select the monkey, and let's make sure that's smooth shaded. And then I'm going to shift select the cabinet, and I'm going to hit Control L, and then I'm going to say modifiers. And that is going to take all the modifiers from the cabinet and put them onto the monkey. You can see here, but I need to set up those different vertex groups and UV layouts. So let me select everything on the monkey, go into my object data properties. So for this, I'm going to create a vertex group called blend with a capital B and assign it. And then I'm going to create a UV map called warp with a capital W. Now, obviously, if you call this something different, you're going to have to go into the modifier and the shader, the modifiers and shader, and you're going to have to change them. Because I'm naming them the same thing, it's going to automatically change everything the way I need it to be changed. So here we need to go back into our UV editing tab, select everything, X0, Y0, and menu, set this to 0, and then this to 0, so that vertex goes to the 0, point, come back to the layout, and you can see, voila, it's already set up. Very easy to do. You can rotate this around, and if I turn off these helpers, you can see that it's blending pretty nicely with the ground plane. I can kind of push that in there. And there we go. We have our dynamically blending monkey. And then if I want more control, of course, I come to the color ramp, and this is how I can individually control things. I can kind of clamp these values down if I want something like that. And then that's just for the monkey. Over here, we have an individual control for the cabinet itself. And then if I want a global control, I just have to grab one of these nulls, or this empty, I should say, and I can move this, and now I have global control over the blending of all the objects that are using the same setup. So there we go. It's pretty quick and easy. Again, I will include this file in the description down below for free. And then, of course, if you want to donate, you have my eternal gratitude and the gratitude of all the other people who are benefiting from tutorials like this. And then, at least hopefully. And then I will also show you how the add-on actually works in this instance. So I have a separate ground plane that has its own material now. So this doesn't have the same material setup. It just has the simple setup that are not even grouped, because if I group them, then the modifier or the add-on's not going to know what to do. And then the same thing with the monkey head. Actually, let me get rid of all this mixed stuff, and then actually, let me do it like this. Let me undo that. And let me create a new material for this. So let's make this red and then turn up. And there we go. Simple material setup for that. Make sure that it's smooth shaded. Okay, so the way that this modifier works is you select whatever you want to blend, and then I believe the ground plane, and then we come over to the modifier, which is or the add-on, which is called Blendit. And then you're saying new blend from. The blend source is going to be the ground add-on layer, which I have here. And this will not be included with the project file download, so just keep that in mind. And then you just click Create Dynamic Blends. It does its thing, and then voila, you have the object, which is blending into the ground. And you can see it lags a little bit because it is these are very geometrically heavy, shader heavy type of things. So it is a little bit laggy, but if you animate this and render it out, you're not going to have a problem with that. Now you'll notice here that the effect is a little different. You can see that there's a lot of warping on that. And the reason for this is because, as far as I understand, that the add-on is actually transferring the texture from the ground plane below and projecting it onto the geometry above. And the nice thing about that is if you don't have an object that has crazy normals like this monkey head, it will actually blend pretty seamlessly or pretty well. The problem with the monkey head, by comparison to the ground plane, it has very perpendicular geometry, and so there's a lot of weird stretching that goes on. And that's one of the unfortunate side effects that you get when you transfer when you kind of project things from one object to another. Now, the nice thing about this is it's contiguous or continuous with the ground plane. You get the texture from below on the texture above, and it looks nice. It looks like this has kind of been sitting there, and some of this stuff has grown up onto it. Like it's been some of this foliage has grown onto the surface there. And from afar, it actually looks pretty good. But if I zoom in close, you can see that there is a lot of warping and stretching, and it's kind of, I don't know, maybe not doing what I want it to do. With this method that we've done over here is you don't get any of that warping and stretching. However, if you look really closely, you can also see that it's not continuous. Like the surface here, you can see is a little bit different. You've got some green stuff here and then some brown stuff here. Fortunately, if you're far enough away, it doesn't really matter. You don't really notice that sort of thing. But if you're close up, it kind of falls apart. And so you kind of have to determine which method is better for you. Now we can kind of force some of that projection if we add in another data transfer modifier here. So if I just do that on this monkey here, data transfer, and move it above the UV warp. And then select the vertex group. If I say face corner data and face data and use UVs, you see that it actually starts to do that, but it's not as well calculated as over here. They're using some slightly different modifier setup here. So I'll collapse this all up. You can see they're using mostly data transfer and the weight proximity. And so they're doing some different stuff there. And I believe it's mostly done through the add-on, through scripting in Python, whereas here we're manually setting this up. So personally, I prefer to do this method without that. I find that it works much better. And then this method here is if you need that projection, then use the add-on for that. Again, it's only €6. It's not that bad. It's like what, maybe $7 American, $7, $8 max in American. I don't know the exact conversion rate off the top of my head. So there are basically two different ways to do this and achieve this effect. I find that the simple setup here works well enough. And then if you really want the setup here, then of course use that. This method doesn't use the UV warp. I think they use vertex colors, and I'm not as good as figuring out how to transfer those dynamically. I find that this workaround with the 0 to 1 and the dynamic, the global and then individual controls using the empties tends to work better. So for here with the add-on, I didn't show this, but it does have like an individual distance, has distance for all the objects that you connect to the ground plane, and then an individual as well. So you do get enough control if that's what you need. And yeah, so this effect, I don't know if I mentioned at the beginning of the video, is somewhat limited. You can't blend, like I can't blend this monkey with the cabinet and the ground at the same time. You can only blend two objects together. So that if this monkey is blending with the ground, it can only blend with the ground. It can't blend with the cabinet. However, we could do this entire setup between the monkey and the cabinet separately. So instead of having this blend with the ground, if I wanted it to blend with the cabinet, instead of taking everything sourced from the ground, I would source it from the cabinet. So here I can get rid of ground and say cabinet. And then of course I would also want to take the material of the cabinet instead of the ground material, transfer that over in the shader here. So instead of this ground material, I would take the cabinet material. So there's a couple ways you could do this. Just keep that in mind. It is somewhat limited. It is geometry dependent, but that's essentially how you would manually set up dynamic proximity blending inside of Blender. So I hope this was helpful. Thank you for watching this far. If you've made it this far into the video, make sure that you subscribe and hit the notification bell if you want more tutorial content like this. And you've got my thanks, and stay safe out there. I'll catch you in the next video. Take care.